I am a divorced woman, and I have 3 children.
Emma was 10.
"12 years, 3 children, 2 jobs she quit for him, and he..."
The day Marcus signed the divorce papers, Sarah thought her life was over. She sat in the parking lot of the courthouse for 45 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, not crying, not moving, just staring at the gray sky above the small town of Millbrook where she had lived her entire life. 34 years old, 3 children, no job, and a house that would be sold by the end of the month. She had given everything to that marriage. 12 years. She had worked 2 jobs while Marcus finished his degree, then quit her career when he said he wanted her home with the kids, then smiled at every company dinner, every holiday party, every moment where she was supposed to be the perfect wife, standing beside the successful man. She had done all of it, every single thing, he asked. And still, one Tuesday morning, he sat her down at the kitchen table and told her he was in love with someone else and had been for 2 years. 2 years. While she was packing school lunches and helping with homework and planning birthday parties, he was living a completely different life. The judge gave her the 3 kids, a small amount of monthly support, and very little else. The house belonged to both of them and had to be sold. Marcus moved into an apartment across town with his girlfriend within 3 weeks. Sarah packed everything she owned into boxes and moved back into her mother's small house on Birchwood Lane with her children, Emma, who was 10, Daniel, who was 7, and little Grace, who had just turned 4. Her mother, Ruth, never said a word of blame. She just made up the spare rooms, put extra towels in the bathroom, and started cooking bigger pots of soup. But Sarah could see the worry behind her mother's eyes every single morning over coffee. The house was too small. The money would not last forever. And Sarah had been out of the workforce for 6 years. She applied for jobs every day. Accounting firms, offices, schools, retail stores. She updated her resume 17 times, trying to make 6 years of raising children sound like professional experience. Some places never called back. A few called and then went quiet after she mentioned she had 3 young children and needed flexible hours. One interviewer actually said, and she never forgot these words, "We need someone fully committed. You understand?" She understood perfectly. The months passed. Emma started having trouble sleeping. Daniel got into 2 fights at school, which had never happened before in his life. Grace stopped talking as much and started carrying a stuffed rabbit everywhere, clutching it like it was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. Sarah would lie in bed at night listening to the house settle and think about how she had somehow failed all 3 of them, even though she had done nothing wrong. The town of Millbrook is small enough that everyone knows most people, but not so small that you know everyone. Sarah had grown up there, but had lost touch with many people during the marriage years, when Marcus preferred they spend time with his colleagues and their wives rather than her old friends. So when she moved back, she felt both completely home and completely alone at the same time. There was a farmer's market on Saturday mornings near the town square. Ruth suggested Sarah take the children, get some fresh air, stop sitting inside reading job listings on her phone. Sarah agreed mostly to stop her mother from worrying for one morning. The market was bright and smelled of apples and fresh bread. Grace immediately cheered up, pointing at everything. Daniel ran slightly ahead, then remembered to slow down and stay close. A habit he had developed lately, this quiet protectiveness of his mother that broke her heart a little. Every time she noticed it, Emma held Sarah's hand, which she had not done in public in about 2 years, and Sarah held on tight. They stopped at a vegetable stand near the end of the row. The tomatoes were perfect, deep red and heavy. Sarah was checking the price when she heard Grace shriek and turned to find her youngest had dropped her rabbit in a puddle near the edge of the path and was standing over it with the expression of someone whose world had just ended. Before Sarah could move, a man crouched down, picked up the rabbit carefully, pulled a clean handkerchief from his jacket pocket, and gently wiped it dry. He handed it back to Grace with a completely serious expression, the way you would handle something genuinely important. Grace took it and looked at him. He looked back. "Good as new," he said quietly. Grace clutched the rabbit and nodded like they had just completed a very official transaction. Sarah almost laughed for the first time in months. The man stood up. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors, and the kind of hands that had done real work. He was not flashy in any way. Plain jacket, worn boots, a manner about him that was slow and careful, like someone who thought before he spoke. "Sorry about the puddle," he said to Sarah, as though the puddle were somehow his responsibility. "She walks directly toward every puddle she sees," Sarah said. "I think she's drawn to them." He smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that stayed in the eyes. His name was Thomas. He had a farm about 4 miles outside Millbrook, had run it alone for the past 8 years, since his father passed and left it to him. He grew vegetables, kept a small apple orchard, had a few animals. He came to the market every Saturday to sell what he grew. He said all of this in the same unhurried way, like he was reading from something steady and settled inside himself. They talked for 12 minutes. Sarah knew because she watched the clock on the church tower, without meaning to, surprised each time another minute had passed. Emma stood slightly behind her mother, listening carefully. Daniel pretended to study a display of squash, but was clearly paying attention. Grace had introduced Thomas to the rabbit, and he had learned its name was Button, and he had treated this information with complete respect. When they left, Grace waved at him. He waved back. On the walk home, Daniel said, "That guy was pretty normal." Sarah was not sure why that made her eyes fill with tears, but it did. Thomas came to the market the next Saturday and the one after that. The third Saturday, he asked if the children liked apples, and then gave Emma a small bag to take home. The fourth Saturday, he asked Sarah, simply and directly, if she would like to have coffee sometime. No elaborate explanation, no lengthy speech. Just a plain question with a plain face, waiting for a plain answer. She said yes before she had time to think about all the reasons she should say no. They had coffee at a small place on Main Street on a Wednesday afternoon while the kids were in school. He arrived exactly on time. He asked her questions and then listened to the answers, which sounds like a simple thing but felt enormous after years of dinners where she could have been furniture. She told him she was divorced. He nodded. She told him she had 3 kids. He nodded again, the same way, like this was information he was filing carefully and not running from. She waited for the shift, the small change in posture, the look that said this is more tea than I signed up for. It never came. He told her he had never married, not because he had not wanted to, but because he had spent his 20s caring for his sick mother and then taking over the farm, and the years had moved the way years do when you are busy with necessary things. He did not say this with self-pity. He said it the way he said everything, like it was simply the true account of what had happened. They had coffee 3 more times over the following weeks. He met the children properly one Sunday when Sarah brought them to the farm. She had planned to stay 1 hour. They stayed 4. Emma helped him pick apples and asked him 40 questions, which he answered every single one. Daniel discovered the barn and became fascinated by the tractor, and Thomas spent 45 minutes explaining how it worked in exact detail, which was clearly the greatest afternoon of Daniel's 7-year life. Grace sat on a fence post with Button and watched the chickens with an expression of pure scientific observation. Driving home, Emma said from the back seat, "He knows a lot of things." Daniel said, "He's going to show me how the irrigation system works next time." Grace was asleep with Button tucked under her chin. Sarah looked at the road ahead and felt something she had forgotten the name of. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was simply the feeling of looking forward to tomorrow. Things did not move quickly. Thomas was not a man who rushed. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. He never promised anything he did not do, and never said anything he did not mean. For someone who had spent years in a marriage where she questioned everything she heard, this was like drinking water after a very long thirst. There were hard days when the money was tight and the anxiety came back, and she wondered if she was too broken for any of this to be real. Days when the children were struggling and she felt the weight of being the only steady thing in their lives. Days when she caught herself waiting for Thomas to disappoint her, scanning for the warning signs that never came. One evening he came to her mother's house for dinner. Ruth made roast chicken. After dinner, Daniel fell asleep on the sofa. Grace climbed into Thomas's lap, completely uninvited, and fell asleep there too, still holding Button. He sat completely still for an hour and a half, so she would not wake up. He and Sarah and Ruth talked quietly at the table, and he did not look at the clock once. When Ruth walked him to the door later, Sarah heard her mother say something she could not quite make out, and heard Thomas laugh softly. She asked her mother later what she had said. Ruth smiled. "I told him she deserves someone steady," he said. He knew that. He said that was the whole point. A year after that Saturday at the farmer's market, Thomas asked Sarah to marry him. He did it on the farm, in the apple orchard, with no audience, no grand gesture, no performance, just the two of them in the evening light, the smell of apples in the air, and a simple question asked by a man who had already answered every harder question with everything he did. She said yes. Emma, Daniel, and Grace were told that same evening, sitting around the kitchen table at Ruth's house. Grace immediately asked if Button could come to the wedding. Thomas said, absolutely. Daniel asked if he could learn to drive the tractor after they moved to the farm. Thomas said they would start in spring. Emma looked at her mother for a long moment and then looked at Thomas and said, "You're not going to leave, are you?" It was not really a question. Thomas looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I'm not." Emma nodded slowly. Then she picked up her fork and kept eating. Sarah watched her daughter's shoulders drop half an inch, a tension she had been carrying for over a year, finally, quietly, letting go. She thought about the parking lot outside the courthouse, the gray sky, The 45 minutes of sitting perfectly still. She thought about how sometimes a life can look completely finished, and then a quiet man with a clean handkerchief crouches down to save a stuffed rabbit from a puddle, and something begins again. Not louder than before, not more decorated or impressive, just real and steady and entirely, completely enough.